great. And Winnie, you could hear me?
I can.
Okay. Okay, it's just after 12 now, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Valerie from the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania, and I want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the Pennsylvania Land Bank Resource Guide. Before we get started, I want to provide you with information on the logistics. Make sure you get online while we talk so you can access the visual component of the presentation. You should have received an email from me yesterday with all those instructions. You click the Ready Talk link, enter your name, email address, and click Register, and then you will be given access to the meeting. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them in using the chat feature in the lower left-hand screen. We'll open up the line for discussion at the end of the webinar and make sure all the questions are addressed. And then afterwards, the PowerPoint presentation I will email you along with additional resources after we're through. Our presenter today is Winnie Branton. She is the principal of Branton Strategies, which helps local governments, community development corporations, and other nonprofit organizations develop successful strategies for combating blight and returning vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties to productive use. She serves as the program manager and trainer for the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania's Land Bank Training and Technical Assistance Program. Winnie educates local governments, nonprofit organizations, and other tax holders on Pennsylvania's land bank law and guides them in evaluating the use of land bank powers to reclaim and repurpose vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties in their communities. She provides technical assistance on developing startup and operating plans, designing tax sale property acquisition strategies, and drafting formation documents. Welcome, Winnie.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be with you today. Share with you the Pennsylvania
Winnie, I'm sorry,
Land Bank.
You're fading.
How about now? Is that better, Val?
Yes, that's better.
And it's my pleasure to share with you the Pennsylvania Land Bank Resource Guide and a little bit of my as a tool for neighborhood reinvestment and economic development. Say thank you to the Housing Alliance for this opportunity.
Yeah, Winnie, I'm sorry. You are kind of going in and out.
Okay, let me put on front. Yeah, I'm on my cell phone. Let me put on a different and then I'll be back on.
Okay.
Is that better, Val?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So today I want to share with you the Pennsylvania Land Bank Resource Guide. It is a self-help resource for assessing land banking and then helping communities plan, organize, and operate a land bank. The publication is going to be at the
Winnie, again, I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm going to hold my phone. Is that better, Val? Hello?
Yes.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, I'm holding my phone.
Make sure
now.
you talk loud, too.
Okay, that'll work. And funding for the publication has been provided through the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation, and the publication is going to be available for download, I believe, next week. And there will be limited hard copies available. A couple of points about the purpose of the Land Bank Resource Guide. It's, again, intended to be a self-help guide for land banks. And it's based on the information gathered and the work that was done through the Housing Alliance across more than 40 communities in Pennsylvania where land bank training and technical assistance was provided with funding from DCED. And it's really intended to build on and expand upon the Blight to Bright publication that the Housing Alliance put out back in 2014. Land banking is one of the tools that's covered in Blight to Bright, and this publication now digs a little bit deeper, showing a step-by-step process for assessing land banking. And then if you choose to go forward, we show you how to plan, organize, and start up your land bank. The Land Bank Resource Guide is a comprehensive guide, and today what I want to do is highlight how it's organized and some of the basic components of the Land Bank Resource Guide. And right here you'll see it shows you the section overviews and how we start at the beginning by just really taking a look at the Pennsylvania Land Bank Guide or the Pennsylvania Land Bank Act, and then moving through with assessment, planning, starting up, and then we conclude with some lessons learned and case studies from 3 Pennsylvania land banks. And in terms of the case studies, I do want to say that the land bank leaders in Pennsylvania who are pioneering land banking in Pennsylvania were very generous with their time and their talents in preparing the resource guide, and I'm very grateful to them for their efforts and for the time they shared with me. Also, there's an appendix to the resource guide which includes sample documents like bylaws, ordinances, business plans, and those are going to be available also through the PA Blight Library, which is at pablightlibrary.com. The guide shows and shares what we've learned from communities over the past 2 years, what's been useful, what has worked. Throughout the guide, I provided insights from those land bank leaders that I've mentioned. And the goal is to help other communities use land banking as a tool for converting problem properties without having to reinvent the wheel. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to talk about an overview of PA Land Banking Act and land bank basics. And I just want to say that to assess whether a land bank is right for your community and to build support for a land bank, you need to understand the state enabling legislation and how land banks work. And land bank leaders across Pennsylvania have reminded me frequently that educating elected officials, residents, community leaders is essential to success. And in Section 1, we lay that out for you. The Land Bank Act in Pennsylvania, 2012, is codified where in 68 PACS at the sections noted. And generally it allows, counties, municipalities with populations of 10,000 or more, and groups of municipalities to create land banks. As we get started, I want to make a couple of general points. First, a land bank is a tool, and to be most effective, it should be part of a comprehensive blight strategy that includes the use of other tools like strategic code enforcement, delinquent property tax enforcement, and a reinvestment strategy. Number 2, land banks are not necessary in all communities. A closer look at your blighted property problem will help you determine if a land bank can help your community. And then third, land banks can't operate unilaterally. They require a working partnership with the county, municipalities, and school districts, as well as the county tax claim bureau or other tax foreclosing body. If we look at the next slide, it's really like, why is this law necessary and why was it enacted? Well, there are roughly 300,000 vacant properties in Pennsylvania. Many of those are abandoned, vacant, and tax delinquent, and they impose tremendous cost on communities, and they actually represent lost opportunities. This graphic from the Philadelphia Land Bank really puts the whole before and after picture into perspective. I love this graphic, and it just shows you what the cycle is like now of vacancy and abandonment and tax foreclosure, and how a land bank can turn that around by clearing title and returning land to use. Okay, who has a land bank in Pennsylvania today? There are 11 land banks in Pennsylvania, Dauphin being the first and Washington County being the most recent. Of those 11, 6 of them are county-based, 3 are city-based if you count Philly as a city. It's also its own county. And then you have two multi-municipal land banks, which are the Northeast PA Land Bank and then Schuylkill County. These land banks run the gamut from large municipalities to more rural counties like Venango. What is a land bank? Essentially, a land bank is a blight remediation tool. If you've looked at Blight to Bright and looked through all the tools available for local governments to address blight, a land bank you'll find in the section on blight remediation tools. It's intended to remediate long-term vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties. It's a tool for getting those problem properties into the hands of new owners and back on the tax rolls. And it can be used for all property types, residential, commercial, and industrial. So why land banks? Well, land banks, according to the Center for Community Progress, there are about 120 land banks nationwide. And land banking represents the latest and best thinking on getting properties back onto the market. As many of you know, economic opportunity and quality of life are diminished by blighted properties and trash-strewn vacant lots. And we want to attack those blighted properties and reinvest in our communities. Another reason why land banking, there are barriers to returning those properties to the tax rolls. And it's challenging locating owners, clearing title and liens, and it discourages private investment. Land banking is intended to remove those barriers and make it cheaper, easier, and faster to return those properties to the tax rolls. When you talk about land banking, we're also talking about uniform, predictable, and transparent process. That is highlighted throughout the state enabling legislation, that's what is expected from land banks. And then lastly, a land bank is intended to be a central hub for blight prevention and remediation efforts. Right now, there is dispersed local government authority and responsibility for dealing with blight. And a land bank can create one spot where the efforts can be centralized and unified so that there's one approach to dealing with blighted properties, and it's a coordinated effort. Why land banks are important? Well, here are the three basic reasons that the Housing Alliance has highlighted throughout its work in land banking, and they are to change the market dynamics, address the high cost, and to harness the positive economics of remediation. First, I want to talk about the market dynamics of blight. Properties with liens that exceed their fair market value are dead in the real estate market. Land banks can help fix that. Secondly, the high cost of blight. Act 47 municipalities and other financially distressed communities are often overwhelmed with abandoned and deteriorating properties. Land banks are a tool that can help communities reduce the cost of just dealing with blight and fighting blight and actually remediating blight. And this graphic on this slide shows the TRICOG study results and some of the findings that they reached when they did a blight study. And it shows what the enormous costs are. That blight costs $250 million a year. It resulted in a 15 to 17% reduction in value to adjacent properties. There was lost tax revenues and over $10 million spent on police, fire, and other departments that had to deal with these properties. So a land bank can address these three components and create an opportunity for communities to rebuild and reinvest. And in terms of the positive economics of blight remediation, there are a number of studies done, and they are highlighted in the resource guide that show how greening lots, demolishing dilapidated properties, can increase surrounding property values and help to build wealth. As I mentioned, counties, municipalities with populations over 10,000, and then groups of municipalities can create a land bank. There are choices to be made in terms of who creates the land bank and where the authority is. There are positives and for each choice, and those are outlined within the resource guide as well. Just to point out, too, that if a borough or township creates a land bank, both the county and the municipality can create a land bank. For instance, in Dauphin County has its land bank, which excludes the city of Harrisburg, but the city of Harrisburg also is able to have its own land bank. So the legislation allows for that. There are other options within the flexibility provided by the Act. For instance, a county can create a land bank and then ask municipalities to opt in by either paying a buy-in fee, like Westmoreland County Land Bank, and also signing off on different agreements for tax sharing and for tax clearing in order to participate. So the legislation that allows municipalities and counties to create land banks offers a lot of flexibility on how to set up the land bank. It's really to try to figure out what works best for your community. It's not a one-size-fits-all. A land bank is created by ordinance and intergovernmental agreements. Again, the appendix to the resource guide has many examples, as you can find those on the Blight Library as well. The ordinances and the intergovernmental agreements need to be filed with DCED and the Department of State, and then a certificate of incorporation is existed, and you're on your way. A big question is, what does a land bank do? Essentially, a land bank acquires, inventories, markets, holds, and transfers interest in real properties. The purpose of that transaction and its powers and the exercise of them is to rehabilitate or demolish properties or get them into the hands of new owners who are going to do improvements to the properties, and those improvements and the development of that property is intended to meet the long-term interests of the community and the surrounding properties. The importance here is that it's not willy-nilly acquisition and disposition. It's targeted acquisition and meaningful dispositions that are intended to advance the local priorities and land use goals for those communities. A land bank is governed by a board of directors, and the board can adopt bylaws. It has to be between 5 and 11 members, and here at least one of the members must be a community resident, not an elected official, and a member of a recognized civic association. That piece of the enabling legislation is intended to promote community connection and transparency, again, key parts of the state enabling legislation. For the land banks already established in Pennsylvania, there is a very strong crossover with redevelopment authority boards, housing authority boards, and agencies that are currently involved in real estate transactions at the local level. And the board is subject to all sunshine and ethics laws. Its meetings are public, and its records and minutes have to be available for public review as well. The state enabling legislation gives land banks the power to hire their own staff or contract out for the use of current municipal employees. Land banks may also staff municipal functions. It's a two-way street. For many Pennsylvania municipalities, land bank-related responsibilities have been assigned to other development agencies at the local and county level, like your redevelopment authority or your housing authority. Westmoreland County Land Bank and Dauphin County Land Bank and Northumberland County Land Bank, they all share a relationship and have some shared staffing for land bank operations. Okay, what local conditions favor creating a land bank? Here's a list of those conditions which are typically looked to for whether or not a land bank can benefit my community. And if you look at this list, you can see that some of these conditions are going to exist in communities where others are not going to exist. For instance, in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, there's a large number of publicly owned properties that have to be addressed or intended to be addressed to their land bank. Others will have properties that have very low market value, and the idea will be to try to return those properties to the market or to some productive use. So here are some of the conditions that you should be looking at as part of the assessment, which I'll get to shortly, to see whether or not your community might benefit from the land bank. What powers does the land bank have? Here, the statute again says all powers necessary or appropriate, and it goes into all the powers that land banks have. The key powers that most communities focus on when they're deciding whether or not to start a land bank are these: that the land bank can acquire, manage, hold, and dispose of property. It can discharge tax liens on property it owns subject to taxing authority approval, and it can move to quiet title expeditiously. Again, no eminent domain power is given to land banks. And I'm going to go through the rest of these powers and overview fairly quickly, because I really want to spend some time talking about the process and then the case studies. So I'm happy to answer questions and share what answers I have if there are more detailed questions on the overview. Property acquisition, many methods for acquiring properties. The key method that many land banks are focusing on is the ability to acquire properties through tax sales and delinquent property tax enforcement. And in the resource guide, I go into some detail about how that happens, especially following how Westmoreland County Land Bank participates in the judicial tax sales there. Here, if you take a look at this slide, it talks about a land bank's ability to purchase tax delinquent property at judicial tax sale. Now, in the resource guide, I go into some detail about the delinquent property tax enforcement process, the sales that are involved, and how those sales operate. But in a nutshell, a land bank can acquire property at a judicial tax sale without having to participate in the public auction. And it does this by negotiating an agreement with the County Tax Claim Bureau or another foreclosing taxing body to purchase the property. And then one of the conditions for that is the land bank gives sufficient notice as set forth in the Land Bank Act before using this power. And the Westmoreland County Land Bank and other Pennsylvania land banks have used this power to acquire properties at judicial tax sale. But this power and its exercise really requires a land bank to work closely with the Tax Claim Bureau and the taxing authorities who have to sign off on the purchase agreement. Holding properties. Again, land banks can hold properties. They're tax exempt while they're held by the land bank. And an example of where this might be useful is where values are going up in a neighborhood. A land bank can acquire properties to ensure that there's property available for public purposes like affordable housing, green space, and even industrial activity. Extinguishing tax liens, another key power that allows municipalities to move these properties back onto the market. As I mentioned earlier, properties that have tax liens that exceed the value of the properties can't move. A land bank can extinguish those liens with the approval of the taxing authorities and get them back onto the market. Expedited quiet title. Again, here there are procedures that are shortened for land banks seeking to quiet title to property. This power is critical because in order to finance purchase and development of properties, you need to have marketable title. And in order to get that and the ability to get title insurance, you have to make sure that you have the appropriate, clear, and marketable title in order to do that. And the land bank legislation provides for a quicker process for getting to that end result if necessary. Property disposition. A couple points here. A land bank has to maintain an inventory. Two good examples are the Westmoreland County Land Bank inventory and the Philadelphia Land Bank inventory. They'll give you an idea of how and what's included and how those inventories might look. For Westmoreland County, I like that they keep on their inventory list the properties that they've sold. They use it as a marketing tool for their own impact as well as to move the properties back to productive use. Here on property disposition, another key point is to note that land banks can negotiate for the purchase of properties, and they don't have to spend just cash. There's opportunities to use other types of consideration like restrictions on future use, and those are all within the discretion of the land bank. Property disposition also gives local governments creating land banks an opportunity to set priorities for disposition. And those priorities can include things like equitable development, private investment, affordable housing, public spaces. All of those are within the realm of property disposition requirements and priorities that a land bank can establish, working in concert with the local government creating the land bank. Biggest question that's all asked is, how do we pay for our land banks? And land banks actually are not provided with any funding under the enabling legislation, but some devices and mechanisms and opportunities for funding are provided. And the biggest one of those under the Act is a tax sharing opportunity, which allows a land bank to recapture up to 50% of the property taxes collected on the property conveyed for up to 5 years. And that is very covered in detail in the resource guide. Here are some of the other options: tax recapture, grant, private and public grants and loans, proceeds from the sales of the properties, and any rents that a land bank may collect if it decides to be a landlord, and then contributions from municipalities. Tax sharing, again, 5 years, 50%, has to be negotiated with the taxing authorities. They all need to sign off and agree. Grants and loans. Here's a list of some of those public grants and loans that might be available for land bank startup and operations. Proceeds, again, from the sales and leasing. Contributions from municipalities. Here, some land banks have received general fund appropriations for their operations. Others have charged member fees for municipalities participating in a county land bank. And then there's also in-kind assistance. And in-kind assistance is popular with respect to mapping and GIS services, as well as property transfers from other public agencies will transfer properties to the land bank for the land bank to try to move those back onto the market. What role do community members play? Again, participation on the board, public meetings and public comment required, and just to focus on transparency and accountability through documents that must be prepared, like an annual audit and report of activities. If you go on to the PA Blight Library, I believe we have posted the Philadelphia Land Bank audit and the Westmoreland County Land Bank audit for 2015, I believe it is. All right, well, that just gives you the general overview of how land banks work and what the legislation allows. And what the resource guide does is it goes through those other steps. Like, now we understand the basics, so now what? you want to take a closer look at land banking and at your community and the problem that you're trying to address in order to determine whether or not it's worthwhile to proceed with land banking. And here are the steps that we've found useful when we've helped communities evaluate whether or not they might benefit from a land bank. In many communities, they start out by creating a task force or a working group to deal with blight. And if any of you were on the webinar last Friday where Chris Galata talked about his publication, which is about creating a blight plan in 5 easy steps, sometimes those task forces or working groups will be created for that purpose, and that group, again, can look at land banking and determine whether or not that's a strategy that should be incorporated into its blight plan. The key decision makers and constituencies about land banks, the resource guide includes a complete list of the types of decision makers and partners that land banks will need to call on in order to be successful. Some of those include your school district and your school board, economic development agencies, affordable housing advocates and developers, real estate agents and their associations, private foundations, and building industry associations. There's a whole list of those included in the resource guide, and this is the group that you're going to be keeping in touch with and staying up to date with as you move through this process, because they will be your partners in making this a reality if that's the decision that you come to. The tax sale process and understanding it go hand in hand with gathering and analyzing relevant data and information. One of the key bits of information that you're going to look at is what is the universe of blighted properties in my community, and what are we doing to address those now, and are we being successful? Do we need other tools to address certain properties that are just stuck and can't be moved? That'll be part of your assessment of land banking and determining whether or not it will work for you. The understanding intergovernmental and interagency dynamics is also part of the assessment process. As I mentioned earlier, there are many, in some communities, there are many different departments and agencies that deal with blighted property. So you're going to want to look at those organizations and agencies and figure out how we can work with them in order to get a land bank, or at least to evaluate a land bank and determine whether or not it'll work for us. Providing for substantial and meaningful public involvement. This goes back again to identifying and including the key decision makers and constituencies about land banks. You also should consider how are you going to let the public know that you are looking at land banking, and how are you going to collect their thoughts and comments and ideas for addressing these properties in your community. And again, when I talk about the public and its involvement, think that the efforts that you make at the beginning to include the public in your preliminary assessment will make for robust community and resident engagement if you move ahead with the creation and operation of a land bank. And that's been a key component of successful land banks so far in Pennsylvania. After you've done your homework, you've educated local officials and decision makers, you've brought all your data together, you understand the tax sale process and how your government agencies work together, you've brought the public in. Now you have to take a look at all that and determine whether or not, with all that information, you can determine whether or not your community might benefit from a land bank. Could a land bank's powers help return problem properties to productive use in the short or long term? Could you use those powers to advance the implementation of previously approved development or community-based plans? If you answered yes, your next step should be to consider whether or not a land bank is feasible. And by feasible, I mean at this early stage, are there any insurmountable obstacles to the creation of a land bank? Like, have any key political leaders said, there's no way in the world that I'm going to support a land bank? That would cause you to pause and maybe think, maybe this isn't going to work out for us. Or if there are just no resources available or that are attainable for a land bank startup, or there's a lack of political will. Those are some of the questions that should be part of your preliminary assessment and determination of feasibility. And if you come out of that with the idea and the conclusion that land banking may help, then your next step would be to plan and organize or begin the planning process for your land bank. And that takes us to Section 3, which covers those topics. And here again, here's just some of the things that you'll need to consider when you're deciding what will our land bank look like. So one of the key questions will be, what will be the jurisdiction? And that goes usually to county or local government. There's pros and cons for both, and options are available under the legislation. Then you're going to look at what are the missions and goals of the land bank, who's going to administer the land bank, and the next part will be to determine what the scope of program activities will be. For instance, some land banks are just interested in acting as a facilitator for transactions. They don't want to hold the property. They don't want to manage the properties. They don't want to rehab the properties. They just want to use their powers to get properties that are stuck and not on the market into the hands of new owners who will improve and develop the properties. The cost of operating that kind of a land bank is much less than the cost of operating a land bank that's going to acquire and hold properties long term, that's going to manage properties, that's going to lease properties. So when you're looking at your land bank and what it's going to look like, it's important to think about what your land bank will be doing. That will definitely impact what the cost of operations will be, and that's very important. Coordinate with local planning and development agencies. That's going to be important too. You want to look at all the plans that have been prepared for your community, economic development plans, comprehensive plans, downtown plans. All of those plans have components that are still not completed, and maybe there's a vacant property or properties out there that can advance the plans that have already been prepared for your community. And talking about plans, there are two plans that are detailed in the resource guide, and that is there are steps and resources included that can help you look at what might be included in a strategic plan for the land bank. And how do we draft a business plan for the land bank and prepare a budget for its first year of operations? The resource guide includes information and shares data on how to do that. And again, those samples of those types of plans are included in the appendix and will be on the PA Blight Library for use for those moving ahead with a land bank. And lastly, you're going to want to draft some acquisition and disposition policies and procedures as part of your planning to show the process for targeting properties for acquisition, and then once a land bank has those properties, how is it going to dispose of those? What land uses are going to be promoted? What pricing is going to be included? Will there be discounted pricing for certain land uses? All of these policies and procedures should be discussed and developed as part of your land bank programming and planning. And again, I'm just really highlighting what's included in the resource guide. There are detailed discussions on all these topics within the resource guide. Okay, for organization, you're going to draft an ordinance authorizing a land bank, and you're going to draft your necessary intergovernmental cooperation agreements. That's how a land bank is formed, and again, samples of these documents are included and a discussion of how to go about deciding what should be included in your ordinance is also part of the resource guide. Building support. How do we get this done? Again, here is where the definition of the problem and a land bank as a solution must be communicated. And communities that have done this have focused on the cost of doing nothing, looking at data that shows what you're currently spending on blight remediation, blight associated activities, and then see what are we losing by not addressing blight. Lost property values, lost revenues, lost opportunities, and a loss of community connection. And you want to highlight how the land bank works with the taxing authorities to get dollars from those properties that have been sitting vacant and underutilized. And you want to share success stories from established land banks in Pennsylvania and nationally. And for the national resources, the Center for Community Progress's website has a number of reports that show successes from around the country, not just in Pennsylvania, and that's been an excellent resource for communities in Pennsylvania looking to move ahead with land banking. In Section 4, we shift to how to set up, start up, and operate a land bank. And here again, the setup and startup really just builds on what you've done to date in your planning, in your programming, and in your preliminary assessment. By now, you have an idea of who in your community is really involved in vacant property, real estate development. Those are the folks that you're going to look to for being a board member. It's important to get those people who are experienced and have some expertise in moving properties to productive use and developing properties. Incorporating and preparing bylaws, that's a function really of the land bank solicitor or the lawyer who's going to be working with the land bank to get those documents filed. Again, we have samples of those included in the resource guide. And now you might have drafted your intergovernmental cooperation agreements, but you have to get them finalized and executed in order to have those be effective as you move forward with setting up and starting up your land bank. And then the policies, too, would have to be approved by your board and be implemented and ready to go as part of your setup and startup. Operations, again, looking back at the basics from Section 1 of the resource guide, remember that a land bank can contract for staff and services. You don't have to create a new agency, and that's what's happening in most land banks in Pennsylvania. The idea is to consider the land bank as a new resource rather than as a new government agency. And here's where there's cost savings. And again, you're relying on the expertise of officials and staff who already understand how the process works. And that is really going to lead to some cost savings. You need to have the necessary insurance and professional services. And again, going back to what the basic requirements are under the enabling statute, you have to have a publicly available inventory of properties so that the public can see what properties you've acquired and what properties might be available and how that property management system is going to operate to move those properties into the hands of new owners. Okay, acquisition and holding of properties. Again, your acquisitions are going to be guided by the land bank's acquisition policy. And that policy should give you some sense of how many and which properties are we going to acquire. A land bank is not going to acquire all of the vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties in its jurisdiction. It's just not feasible or practical, and there's no dollars to do that. So the acquisition is going to be targeted and intentional, and most land banks, as I said, will want to move those properties quickly to new owners. Discharging liens and clearing title is essential to moving the properties back into productive use. The land bank has to be able to offer clear, insurable title to potential buyers and redevelopers. And this needs the approval of the taxing authorities, and again, looking at what assistance is there. It's the expedited quiet title process, if necessary, to see that that happens. Disposal in accordance with local priorities as set forth in your disposition policy, in accordance with other established criteria that should be spelled out in the disposition policy. Are we going to pre-qualify purchasers to make it easier for us to act as a facilitator? We have to look at our local land use plans. And remember, the idea is to dispose of these properties in a way that's going to bring new opportunities to your community, new housing, new businesses, new parks, new green space, new jobs. Record keeping. You got to keep minutes and records of your proceedings, and the other requirements are the annual audit and annual report of activities, and both those documents need to be filed with the DCED. Examples of those are, again, on our website. I think I included some sample minutes as well, so you could see what land bank's procedural minutes look like. Section 5, lessons learned and case studies. Here, what I did was include, with the help of land bank leaders at 3 Pennsylvania land banks, which were Westmoreland County Land Bank, Philadelphia Land Bank, and the Dauphin County Land Bank. And there's 3 case studies in the guide. Each includes information on budgets, administrative costs, transactions, and projects. And there's also a discussion about what have we learned so far. And here are really the key lessons learned. Data is critical to show support and generate support. Getting everybody to the table early. Use what you already have. Be patient, but not too patient. This is complicated for transitioning from a very dispersed and non-uniform process to a uniform process that's understandable and transparent. And finally, that leadership matters. Where land banks have been created successfully, there's been a champion who's pushed it forward and hasn't let it rest until the land bank's been created and is up and running. And I want to just briefly talk about the 3 case studies. The first one is Westmoreland County Land Bank. And on your screen, you'll see a picture of the former Monsoor Hospital. During 2014 and 2015, the Westmoreland County Land Bank purchased 31 properties. I think a recent report has that number up to 41 properties in 13 communities. Many have been purchased through tax sales. The Monsoor property was abandoned in 2006, purchased by the land bank at tax sale for about $15,000. The buildings have been demolished and the property is being marketed for sale and redevelopment with an assessed value of $2.5 million. This property has received the most press, but many properties that the land bank has acquired and sold are residential, needing rehab or demo. It's a great partnership between the county land bank and municipalities. Municipalities have to pay $5,000 to join, and there were 16 participating as of the end of 2015. And more details are included in the resource guide. The next case study is Dauphin County Land Bank Authority. This is a picture of, actually the before picture. I'm going to shift to the after picture and show you what the plans are for this site. Dauphin was the first PA land bank. It had 2 projects completed by the end of 2015, and this is the Tuscarora Street property. The property went through a cycle where there was a fire, it was abandoned, the property deteriorated, it became a dumping ground, a safety hazard, and the land bank acquired the property and is working in partnership with a private developer to build 5 new homes shown in this artist rendering, which will have back deck views of the Susquehanna River, and the asking prices are about $125,000. Our next case study is the Philadelphia Land Bank. It's the largest municipality with a land bank. It was created to convert both surplus publicly owned and tax delinquent privately owned properties to productive use. By the land bank's count, there are about 8,000 surplus publicly owned properties and 24,000 tax delinquent privately owned properties. It's in its first year developing a strategic plan as required by the local ordinance. Goals set forth in the plan included promoting equitable development, extending private investment, and expanding green space. In December 2015, the land bank acquired its first 500 publicly owned properties. For 2016, its target is to acquire 2,000 or to have a total of 2,000 publicly owned properties and 250 privately owned tax delinquent properties. This week, the land bank got its first conveyances approved by the Vacant Property Review Committee in Philadelphia, which is part of the process for Philadelphia. So those three land banks are just some of the examples of what Pennsylvania communities are doing with this new tool for land banking. And in conclusion, before I open up for some questions, I just want to highlight a couple things of what we hope that you will use the Land Bank Resource Guide for. The first part is definitely assessment. You need to assess so that you can persuade if you determine that it's important to move ahead with planning, organizing, and operating a land bank. The beauty of the Land Bank Act and the Training and Technical Assistance Program that the Housing Alliance performed over the last couple of years is that it's left to local decision makers. It's not mandated. It's your choice. It's an available tool. Assess and determine whether or not this tool fits within your needs, and the resource guide can show you how to move from deciding that you want to have a land bank to actually getting one up, started, and operating. And again, just to highlight that we've included documents like ordinances, business plans, bylaws, and budgets in the resource guide and on PA Blight Library. And I feel as if I have run through this, but I hope that for those who are able to, that you can join us in Latrobe on May 11th and 12th, where there'll be an opportunity to discuss in more detail what's happening in Pennsylvania and how communities are beginning to embrace land banks as a tool, and you'll be able to see those successes and hear about those successes from those land bank leaders in Pennsylvania. So Val, I think we can open it up for questions now.
The conference has been unmuted.
All right, I'm going to look at, I see a couple of questions here.
Thank you, Winnie. I did open it up, I just wanted to point out that there are some questions. If you wanted me to read them, or are you able to view them on the lower left-hand side?
I'm looking at them right now.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right, the first question would be, would a township with a population of 10,000 or more be able to have a land bank for itself, or would you recommend teaming up with another municipality? That's a great question, and it really depends on a couple things. One is we found that with multi-municipal land banks, it really depends on the organization and the organizers and the relationships. And I'll give you an example of some discussions. In one municipality, there is discussion about joining with a couple others that are neighboring municipalities, but then you get into the question of how will the board be selected and who will have ultimate control. All of those questions would have to be worked out where more than one municipality are teaming up to work together. And the Northeast PA Land Bank Authority and Schuylkill County Land Bank, the documents on the PA Blight Library, I believe we have their intergovernmental cooperation agreements. They'll show how those groups have worked out those questions.
Don't look at it. See?
Hello? We can.
Thank you. I'm going to mute everyone, and then if you could star 7 yourself.
Okay.
The conference has been muted.
Existing land banks have tax capture or tax sharing of real estate for support. And to my knowledge, looking at the ordinances, and I believe that all of them have the power in their local ordinances to do that. Some have chosen or are in the process of choosing whether or not to insist that school districts participate in the tax sharing. But for the most part, the land banks are going to need all 3 of the taxing authorities to sign off on the tax sharing, because there is no funding otherwise, or I shouldn't say there is no funding otherwise. There are limited funding resources available, and the tax sharing and tax recapture was really created to allow that to happen. And some communities have found it that it takes a considerable amount of time to educate school districts in particular about the benefits of the land banks and the basis for encouraging them to sign off on the tax recapture. So I'm going to say for the most part, the land banks in Pennsylvania will need to rely on the tax recapture in order to fund their operations. All right, let me see if there's another. Another question is, how does this facilitate the small individual developer to be able to compete with the big boys in acquiring properties to develop? Are there incentives or priorities for very green, passive house type projects? Well, again, the first question I think is answered by stating that the land bank is charged with having a open, transparent, and accountable process for acquiring and disposing of its properties. Is that going to make it likely that individual developers are going to be on the same plane as big boys in acquiring and developing property? I can't say that, but it certainly will give you an opportunity to see what properties are available. How those properties are disposed of. It gives you an opportunity to go to land bank board meetings and participate by giving public comment, objecting to procedures or decisions that they make in a public forum. So you have the opportunity to participate, which I think will add to those smaller developers being able to compete with the bigger developers. But again, land banks are dealing with properties that typically nobody else wants. So there is likely to be little competition for vacant lots or individual properties in some communities where the real estate market isn't really exploding. So we expect that in communities where there are land banks operating, that there will be opportunities for the smaller developer as well as the larger developers. And in terms of your second part of the question, incentives or priorities for very green, passive house type projects, those
Winnie?
Those properties and projects, it would really be up to the local government and the land bank to determine whether or not those types of properties would receive any kind of priority treatment. And that's all spelled out in the land bank's disposition policies. Hello?
Nice. Yes.
Okay, we're still on? Okay. I kept hearing beeps. So, and that really gets us to 1 o'clock. So, Val, I know you wanted to give a couple of announcements. And again, if anybody has other questions, I'm happy to answer those. If you just email me or call me, I'm happy to follow up with you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Winnie. Yes, I just wanted to reiterate the fact that we're doing our statewide Land Bank Summit on May 11th and 12th in Latrobe. And as Winnie mentioned, we're going to have both her and Chris doing their publications that will be released. We have Westmoreland County talking about their land bank success. We also have the national expert out in Cuyahoga County coming, talking about all their success in that area. You're going to be learning from a lot of the established land banks and sharing of ideas. And then we conclude with a walking tour of the surrounding land bank properties from the Westmoreland County Community College in that area. So that'll be a lot of fun. So we really hope you can join us. Again, I mentioned that I will be sending out the PowerPoint from Winnie's presentation, so I will be sure to include the link to register as well as some details about that coming up. And do be on the lookout next week. We will be having the release of both of those publications from Chris and Winnie, and they will also be in e-publication form. So there'll be a link electronically online to those publications, and you will be given hard copies at the Land Bank Summit on May 11th and 12th. So again, thank you, Winnie, so much, and thank you, everyone, and we will be in touch.
Thanks, Val.
Okay. All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.